We know that some folks will continue to pop in, but I think we can probably get started at least with the introduction. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are here for our wonderful panel on making de-extinction extinct, why current scientific efforts to bring back extinct species should be terminated. This webinar is brought to you by the GW Animal Law and Science Project, which Lori Marino and I lead. And the idea is to talk about de-extinction. De-extinction is the idea that extinct species can be brought back into existence through various scientific methods. As scientific capacity continues to advance rapidly, de-extinction has become a larger focus of debate and attention. Candidate species include the dodo, passenger pigeon, woolly mammoth, dire wolf, and even more far-reaching dinosaurs. While some scientists and others are kind of giddy with excitement over this possibility, others are cautious about the potential pitfalls of bringing back animals for whom there's no veterinary experience, who have no current natural habitat, and in a situation that could even lead to the exploitation and reduced protection of highly endangered species who already are here and need our help. In this webinar, we'll explore de-extinction from the animal welfare point of view, taking our lead from the fraught ethical issues associated with ongoing highly invasive research with sentient animals. And we conclude that there's little, if any, justification for de-extinction other than scientific curiosity. But we'll have that conversation. We're going to explore this issue, as well as the ways the law and other societal guardrails can address the use or prescribe the continued use of animals for de-extinction purposes. We are joined today by our wonderful guests. We have Heather Browning from the University of Southampton, who's the author of many articles on the ethics of de-extinction and is a leading expert in the field. We have Grant Wilson, who's the executive director of the Earth Law Center, and focuses on using the rights of nature as a legal strategy to protect animals and habitats. And we have Dr. Lori Marino, the founder and executive director of the Camilla Center for Animal Advocacy and founder and president of the Whale Sanctuary Project, a neuroscientist with over 30 years of experience with animal behavior and intelligence. And I'm your moderator. I'm Kathy Hessler. I'm the assistant dean of the Animal Law program here at GW Law School. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. So a couple of quick housekeeping things first. This event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. I'll put the link to that channel in the chat shortly. So we're going to have each of our guests speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for conversation. We're looking forward to answering your questions, so please put your questions in the Q&A section, the button below, not the chat, but the Q&A, and then we'll be able to address them all. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lori Marino.
Hey everyone, I'm going to share my screen. And I hope you all can see that. What I'm going to do is, ahead of our two wonderful guests, is sort of give you a little primer on de-extinction, what it is, what it isn't, what are the methods that are used to achieve it, and some of the things that have been going on regarding the influence of de-extinction on conservation issues. So let's get started. I think this is familiar to all of you who about 3 weeks ago were inundated with this kind of image and this kind of title, "The Dire Wolf is Back." The organization Colossal has birthed 3 pups that contain the DNA from the extinct dire wolf. And there were lots and lots of spectacular headlines like this until everyone started to realize that it's not really the case that the dire wolf is back, that it's much more complicated than that. But this sparked so much interest and concern about de-extinction that I think that this excitement is here to stay. So, as Kathy said, de-extinction, also known as resurrection biology, is a method of creating new versions of extinct species. And it's really worth noting that in 2016, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, created a de-extinction task force, and they created a guide for principles on creating proxies of extinct species for conservation benefit. And it's a very important document. Notice I underline word proxies because that is what is being produced, not the actual extinct species, but some stand-in for that species. And I want to highlight a statement straight out of the IUCN document. None of the current pathways for de-extinction will result in a faithful replica of any extinct species due to genetic, epigenetic, behavioral, physiological, and other differences. For the purposes of these guidelines in the document, the legitimate objective for the creation of a proxy of an extinct species is the production of a functional equivalent able to restore ecological functions or processes that might have been lost as a result of the extinction of the original species. So right here, they're laying down a number of flags. They're saying that this is not the actual extinct species, it's a proxy, that the best we can do is a functional equivalent, but also that the only goal that this should have is to restore ecology. And that's where the rub is. That's where a lot of the issue and uncertainty comes in. There are a number of methods used for de-extinction. All of them are fairly related. One method that's been around a long time is backbreeding or selective breeding, where you take traits from an extinct species that are similar to a living species and selectively breed the living species until it more and more closely resembles the extinct species. And we do this with dog breeding and all kinds of farmed animal breeding, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with this is that there is no guarantee that the selected traits will breed true or be expressed in the way we think. Cloning has become a sort of an everyday part of the scientific furniture, producing genetically identical copies. We all remember Dolly, the sheep, who was cloned a while ago. The problem with cloning is that it requires living tissue, and extinct species aren't always, there's no living tissue, and that there are developmental abnormalities and premature aging associated with cloning in general. There are telomere issues. Dolly the sheep, for instance, had a lot of health problems, and she died at a prematurely young age. Then there's the big one, CRISPR, genomic editing or synthetic genomics, which manipulates a living organism's genetic material by deleting, replacing, or inserting a DNA sequence. And you can even synthesize this. The problem is that it creates hybrids not identical to the extinct species. The current methodology being used is CRISPR. It's a cut and paste methodology that deletes and adds genetic material with a lot of precision. And so it can be used to add genes from an extinct species into an extant species. The problem there is that there are not whole DNA sequences available from extinct species. It creates hybrids, and the effects of hybridization are unpredictable. So just to take you through what this would look like if we wanted to create a woolly mammoth, you'd have a mammoth and some tissue, a frozen mammoth, some DNA. You'd extract that from the mammoth specimen and you'd compare it with the genome of the closest living relative, and say an Asian elephant. And then what you would do is you would take that part of the mammoth genome that makes it a mammoth, put it into a cell from an elephant, an extant elephant, and create an egg, an ovum from stem cells. And that nucleus then it develops either in a surrogate elephant mother or potentially an artificial womb. So what develops is not an Asian elephant. It's not a mammoth. It is something like a hybrid, an Asian elephant with some mammoth genes in it. And the thing that's always concerned me about this is that when you see situations like headlines like the dire wolf is back, and they show you these adorable, furry, little howling creatures, these little babies, and everyone says, "Oh, how cute." But they never tell you what it took to get those creatures. They never tell you that they're the survivors of a whole process, and that process was not exactly pretty. So let's have an example, the de-extinction numbers game. Let's look at Celia. She was a Pyrenean ibex. Here she is in a museum. About 20 years ago, they went extinct, and there was an effort to recreate her species. So they took Celia's DNA and they put it in the eggs of 728 goats. Let's drop down. From these eggs, 402 actually developed. Let's drop down again. 57 were transferred into surrogate goats. Let's go. Only 7 were viable. And of those, only 1 was born who died minutes after birth. So the ibex went extinct twice. But this gives you an idea of the kind of inverted pyramid of numbers that's behind all of these so-called successes. And it's an animal welfare issue. The kind of candidates that to date have garnered a lot of attention tend to be the charismatic megafauna. Even though the stated primary rationale for de-extinction is framed around ecology, reestablishing populations, helping ecologies heal, the species that are the targets are not exactly ones that you would pick if you really were working along that rationale. They're the spectacular, charismatic megafauna. We've got the saber-toothed cat, the Tasmanian tiger, the thylacine, the dodo, passenger pigeon, they're all well known. The woolly mammoth, there are colossals already said they're working on the woolly mammoth. And there's also dinosaurs, right? So if we really want to go deep, we can get into that kind of Jurassic Park scenario, where you have not dinosaurs, but something new, something that's not a dinosaur, not a reptile, not a bird, not just something else, a new life form with all the risks associated with that. And the one that I'm also very, very concerned about is the Neanderthal. There has been talk about de-extincting Neanderthal people. And I think we can all agree that we're getting to a point where we need to take a step back and take a look at these choices. The IUCN sees de-extinction as a moral hazard, which is a situation whereby one party takes more risk because the other party will bear the cost. Changing public perceptions could undermine our current future conservation efforts if people get so enamored with the creation of proxies and providing and thinking that there's always a techno fix for all the things that we do, so that there will, it doesn't matter if African elephants go extinct, we'll have mammoths. Somebody will find a way to re-engineer them back into existence. And the IUCN is very concerned and says over and over in their document that the priority must be preservation of extant biodiversity and restoring biodiversity. And the question is this the way to go? So if you look at this from a benefit risk analysis, there are some benefits that are stated having to do with de-extinction. The claim that it can promote biodiversity and restore ecosystems. The fact that it could capture public interest in science and animals conservation. There are socioeconomic gains associated with this kind of effort. And it could be used, the methodology could actually be applied to extant species to prevent them from going extinct. But I would ask, can't we get there another way and do the risks? Are these benefits outweighing the risks? The risks or disadvantages are that, and this is straight out of the IUCN, that creating proxies can create organisms that can harm, damage ecosystems, that can become, quote, invasive, that there is decreased support for preventing extinctions because we can just bring them back. There are animal welfare issues, which Dr. Browning will tell you more about. Unacceptable suffering. Risks to surrogate animals. Who's going to be the elephant who carries the first woolly mammoth? Uncertainty about the outcome and effects on others in ecology, the creation of novel disease vectors, inadvertent resurrection of ancient diseases, hybridization, and of course, re-extinction. To me, the disadvantages vastly outweigh any potential benefits because these disadvantages have the potential to cause irreparable, irreversible harm. This is a methodology with a high risk of being exploited, and our species has a really poor track record in animal welfare and abuse. And I would point you to the whole area of zoos and rewilding as an example of something that is claimed to be helpful and important, but has really pretty much been a failure except for a handful of species. So this picture, a mammoth in a zoo, is what I worry about. And I ask you, is this the future? Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. And we're going to be shifting to Heather. That was wonderful, very thought-provoking. And just a quick reminder while Heather's putting up her slides to put your questions in the Q&A. Thanks. Thank you, Heather.
All right, thank you. Okay, so Laurie set the scene now about sort of what de-extinction is and some of the general ethical issues with it. What I'm going to be doing now is drilling down a little bit into the specific ethical issues that come around animal welfare and how it is we think about the harms to the animals themselves. That is the animals who are used in the process of de-extinction, so the different experimental animals and the animals that are created, and as well some of the animals that are impacted perhaps after these are released. So I think, when we're thinking about why to include animals, it's really important to think about the fact that, when we're designing and implementing research, we need to include the voices of the different stakeholders in that research. And those are the people who are impacted. So anyone who's going to be affected by what's happening in that research should have a voice in how that science is designed and how it's implemented. And that includes the animals themselves, which is something that I think is often overlooked. So animals aren't just research subjects, but they are actually subjects in the richer sense of the word, in that, they have their own internal experience, their own first-person point of view on the world, their own preferences and desires. And so because of this, they also have interests in how research is done and what the outcomes of it are. So, when we're thinking about why should we care about the animal welfare impacts, it's precisely because of this. These animals are subjects whose points of view or voices, in the sort of loosely speaking, need to be heard in terms of this. And certainly, when we think about talk of de-extinction, there is a lot of discussion about the ethics of de-extinction projects. So, some of the issues that Laurie brought up are getting a lot of attention right now because of the direwolf having come back out. And this is a selection of sort of, headlines here that are questioning the ethics of these de-extinction projects. But what is interesting is that animal welfare is almost never mentioned, and not a single one of these articles here that I've listed brought up animal welfare at all as one of the concerns about whether or not we should be doing this. So these ethical concerns about the direwolf, no one's really thinking about the direwolf themselves or these animals. And I think that is an oversight. I think it is one of the really important, perhaps the major kind of ethical harm that's associated with de-extinction projects. So I think, there's kind of two reasons given often to dismiss, why animal welfare isn't something that needs to be thought about when de-extinction projects are taking place. The first one is that, we don't need to think about it because de-extinction actually won't create significant welfare harms, so it's not a problem. And the second one is that, well, the welfare concerns that are happening in de-extinction projects aren't any different to ones that are happening in other areas, other research programs that are similar. They cause the same kinds of harms, and we already accept those. So there's no reason to talk specifically about the ones that list come up with de-extinction. And as I'm going to talk about here, I think that both of those sort of objections are misguided. I think that de-extinction can potentially create significant welfare harms. And in some cases, those are unique harms, so they are specific to de-extinction projects. But even where they're not, we still need to be talking about them. The kind of justification that it's okay because it happens over here doesn't justify doing it in another space. You need to reassess the ethics in every separate project. So the animal welfare concerns come up sort of at, I guess, 3 different stages of the full process. So the first is in whatever de-extinction process is going to be used. So here I'll talk about gene editing because that seems to be what's being done most often. But obviously, if it's backbreeding or cloning or something like that, there are other types of harms associated with that. Then there's the sort of the captive rearing and the housing and husbandry that's associated with those animals, after they're born, as they're being raised, and perhaps for their entire lifetimes if they're being held in captivity. For those that aren't being, then there's potential welfare harms associated with reintroduction as well. And so I'll go into some of the details now about these different potential harms. So the first, when we're thinking about gene editing, one of the worries in general with gene editing projects, whether or not this is for de-extinction, is the potential for sort of off-target effects. So, genetics is vastly complicated. Lots of genes have lots of different impacts throughout the sort of body of an organism. And changing genes can change things that you don't necessarily expect them to do. So you might be bringing in genes that you think make an animal more like a mammoth, but those can create physiological and anatomical changes that lead to downstream health problems and lead to behavioral changes as well that can make an animal worse off in terms of welfare. And there is this concern also about low success rates. So Laurie had that nice kind of upside down pyramid there that showed this kind of attrition from the first to the last animals that are used. And we can see that in de-extinction. So here's a quote from a New York Times article about the direwolf project, where it says, they created a large number of embryos. Most of these embryos failed to develop. 4 pups were born, one of which then died from a ruptured intestine. We don't hear very much about this guy, but they say, autopsy showed it was not from the result of a harmful mutation. They don't say what it was from the result of. So it's unclear what went wrong here. Is it something in their rearing procedures? Was there something genetic with this animal? But either way, you can see that there are all these embryos that fail to develop. There are animals that are born that die soon after. And so you're going to have these problems arising from the welfare issues associated with those low success rates. There's also going to be the issues around the test subjects. So it's not just the animals that are produced at the end, not just the sort of the mammoths and the direwolves, but all the animals that are tested along the way. And so these are little golden fluffy mice here, ones that were reported on fairly recently. These were mice that are being tested on as part of the mammoth de-extinction project. And this was a proof of concept to test whether or not the genes for mammoth hair types could be activated in other animals. And so essentially they took laboratory mice and they gene edited them to have these genes that woolly mammoths have to create this coat type. And it was considered a success because, as you can see, they're very different from regular mice, and so they did get these coats. But what we need to think about is the fact that these mice are living their lives now in laboratories. So the picture at the bottom shows, the typical housing for a laboratory mouse. It's for sort of a social and curious animal, not a particularly enriched or large environment. And so again, the justification is, well, that's just how all laboratory mice live. But that's not a reason to not do better for your own personal project. So this is a harm that's happening to these animals in the course of this project. And any of the testing procedures that they undergo obviously create potential harms as well. Things like capture, blood draws, any surgeries, autopsies, these kinds of things. And so, the animals that are tested to use in this project in the process of developing gene editing are also going to face harms as well. And then when we think also about the sort of the gestation and the birth of these animals, there are potential problems too. So particularly with cross-species surrogacy, you often see maternal fetal incompatibilities where the body of the mother essentially tries to reject the fetus because it has certain genetic markers that they don't recognize as belonging to themselves. And so with gene editing, there's always that possibility. We think again of the mammoth and Asian elephant case, or these are dire wolves who were born from a domestic dog. There's also the risk of just gestational and birthing problems. So we look here, this graphic shows the difference in size between a standard mammoth and an Asian elephant. And so, the worry is that a mammoth calf is just going to be way too big to safely gestate in an Asian elephant. Certainly for the dire wolves, they performed a cesarean section to birth those animals because they were so worried about this kind of risk of birthing problems. But a cesarean section is obviously itself a major surgery. And so these concerns about, how it is that we do surrogacy in a way that's going to be safe for the mother means that there's potentially harms there, both for the mother and for the birthed offspring as well, who may not survive these procedures. And then we move on to the rearing issue. So when we think about keeping any animal in captivity, so animals that are housed in zoos and various other areas, require detailed husbandry standards to understand how to keep them well. If we want to give them anything resembling sort of a good life in their captive environment, we need to know, what's their diet, what are their environmental preferences, how much light, what kind of sound, what kind of shelter do they need, what are their behavioral requirements, what sort of natural behaviors do they need to express, health management, what kinds of diseases are they susceptible to, how are those diseases treated, and the social conditions, what is their social world and how can we make sure they have the right kinds of social connections. And so a lot of information goes into these standards here, and it's not at all clear that for de-extinction programs that this is at all possible to do. And so I think this is something that's particularly unique to de-extinction. So this sort of argument that it's not any different, I think this is the one area where it really is. Because if we think about where do these husbandry standards come from, usually it's from going out and looking at species in the wild and going, okay, well, what do they do out there? Using trial and error on captive populations. A lot of current zoo standards come from a lot of mistakes that were made in the past, or looking at closely related species and estimating, in what ways they'll be similar. But a lot of these things are just unavailable for de-extinction projects. There aren't wild conspecifics. We can't go out and look at mammoths and say anything about what they need, what were their social systems, what were their diets. The amount of information you can gain from kind of paleontology, from historical data is obviously going to be very, very small. And thinking about the closely related species and estimating from them, the Asian elephant is just not that closely related. It's not that similar ecologically. We're not sure that it's going to be similar socially or behaviorally or in terms of diet. And we don't have the captive populations to do trial and error on. And certainly there's a welfare issue while we do. If you're trying to figure out what kind of diet do they need, what milk composition do they need when they're young, how do they learn their social behaviors, all these sorts of things are going to be problems. So, for animals like the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger that's more recently extinct, some of that information might be there. The quagga, which is this other picture, it's a zebra relative, is perhaps close enough related to the zebra, but many of the species we're looking at can be different enough. And when we're looking at gene-edited animals that are actually hybrids, that are actually new things, they may not be similar enough to either of the two original species to make those kinds of inferences either. So they might have needs that we're just not at all aware of. And thinking about, these animals lived, in many cases, a very long time ago in conditions that we just don't have access to, that we don't necessarily know what it is that they were sort of raised in and what they need to thrive. And then some of these things may not be available now. So even if we knew what they were, we may not be able to provide them. For instance, the food sources for the woolly mammoth. Do we know what they ate? Are there plants that just don't exist anymore? Are there, mosses and things that we can't get access to that made up large parts of their diet? We may not actually be able to give them what they need. And this is even more true for social animals with social groupings. When we've got these first little woolly mammoths born, who are they going to live with? How are they going to learn the social behaviors? I mean, elephants, if we take them as a model, have extremely large cultural histories that are passed down across generations. We don't have any access to that in the case of mammoths. Maybe they can learn some things from their elephant parents, but they're not the kinds of things they need to know to be mammoths. And we see this now with these little dire wolves, who's teaching them to be wolves? They were born of domestic dogs. They live in a pack of 3 pups. In terms of learning how to socialize, what kinds of mating behaviors, what kinds of interactive behaviors they need, it's very, very unclear where that information is coming from and that they're going to be able to grow up to be psychologically normal animals because of that. And then finally, we've got the issues that come up with reintroduction. So, I mean, these are more general issues with any reintroduction programs that are sort of emphasized or made worse by the fact that we have less information about the animals. But for any animal, if you're conditioning it for a release, you need to give it sort of the conditions it would experience in the wild. And those are quite often worse things than it's going to have in captivity. They're going to have less food. They're going to be killed by predators. They're going to experience all kinds of unpleasant weather events. They're going to have aggression with other animals. And they need to learn how to deal with all these things. So the process of training them to deal with those things is going to be itself unpleasant. And then going out into the wild and dealing with them over their lifetime, also negative. And many of these programs are unsuccessful. These are examples here of 2 species that, reintroduction programs are done. The mallee fowl's an Australian bird, the golden lion tamarin's a Brazilian primate, where reintroductions failed mainly because of predation. These animals didn't know how to avoid predators and they were killed. Animals need to be able to find food, all of these sorts of things. Very, very difficult to actually train animals for release in a way that respects their welfare. So, I mean, I think one thing that we should be looking for from any de-extinction program is a clear and publicly available welfare plan. It's almost impossible to get information at the moment on, what the housing and husbandry kind of conditions are for animals that are being done. But, how is this organization intending to meet the species' physical and psychological needs? How do they even know what these needs are? How are they planning to detect and respond to welfare problems? How are they going to assess and monitor welfare over time? And this last one, assessing welfare is really an issue because when we're typically trying to assess welfare for some species, we use behavioral tests like the sort of preference tests. We can see this pig in these boxes here, or physiological tests looking at cortisol levels or something. And those are all based on reference values that comes from vast knowledge of the species. For species, again, either extinct or new hybrid species, we don't have those reference values. And so how do we know, when they are in poor welfare states or when they're in good welfare states? We may not even be able to tell when they're experiencing harms, and that should be a worry too. So then just briefly to finish up on this question of justifications, Laurie talked about this a little bit already. Certainly, the idea of justifying de-extinction in the face of these harms, I think there's this accepted practice standard that I've already talked a bit about, this idea that, well, it's okay because these sorts of harms are done elsewhere for similar sorts of gains. I think that's not a strong justification. We shouldn't take accepted practice as a justification for doing something bad if it doesn't itself have benefits. And so then, of course, there is this idea that the welfare harms are outweighed by other kinds of gains in other areas. And I won't go through these in detail, but there's all these different sorts of potential gains that I talked about. Laurie talked about them as well. Conservation gains, perhaps scientific gains, these sort of human gains to getting more of the things we like in the world. And I think firstly, it's not very clear how many of these things are going to be achieved by de-extinction projects, how many of them are achieved by de-extinction projects in a way that couldn't be achieved by other projects, but also how many of them are valuable enough to outweigh the potential welfare harms. So certainly this is a quote from Ron Sandler, who wrote on this a decade ago now. He says, a deep de-extinction, so thinking about de-extincting these long ago species like your mammoths, does not address any pressing ecological or social problems, and it does not make up for past harms or wrongs. As a result, there is not a very strong ethical case, let alone an ethical imperative, for reviving long extinct species or developing the capacity for doing so. Taking on significant costs and risks or funneling scarce resources to pursue it is not justified. Deep de-extinction is in many respects a luxury. And so then, he says, well, it's fine to pursue it if people want, so long as it does not interfere with or compromise ethically important things. So here, if we think, most of the benefits are going to be, in terms of things that humans like, not things that we need to function in the world, and that there are these kinds of harms that are coming from welfare, it seems very unlikely that the cost-benefit scale is going to tip in favor of doing de-extinction projects. So I guess one little suggestion for a potential way forwards if we are going to keep doing these kinds of projects is thinking about careful selection of species to improve that harm-benefit trade-off. So perhaps some species have simpler welfare needs that are easier to meet in captivity. The gastric brooding frog is one kind of de-extinction candidate that, in general, amphibians aren't cognitively complex animals that need huge amounts of space. So perhaps those are animals that can be kept with higher welfare in captivity. So selecting these kinds of animals rather than these charismatic megafauna, which are very likely to have complex intellectual and social needs, would be a much better way forwards. And perhaps also thinking of animals that are more recently extinct. So the thylacine, which has gone extinct only within the last 100 years, we still know quite a lot about it. There are still people who, well, probably not so many now, but there were, people who remember having seen them in captivity, having had them in zoos there. And so perhaps there is more information that we can use. And we also want to make sure that sort of the relevant ecosystems are still in place. So again, for something like the thylacine, not that much has changed in the world, so they could go back out there perhaps without too much harm. But for something like the passenger pigeon, you're looking at this picture here, their ecosystem consists of literally millions of birds. And those aren't still there. That ecosystem isn't in place. And so it's unclear how you can provide what they need to thrive out there in the wild. So to wrap up then, I think the animal welfare challenges that face de-extinction programs are more significant than this sort of typical assumption that it's just, what's happening in other projects. And because of this, I think the projects require a strong motivation to justify these harms, and it's not really clear in most cases that there is one. But certainly, if de-extinction projects are to continue, there should be a clear welfare plan in place for each project, for each different species, and a focus on carefully selecting the right species to minimize welfare harms and maximize perhaps the ecological benefits. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was fantastic. And so our next speaker will be Grant Wilson. Thanks, Grant.
Hi, wonderful to be here. Thank you, everyone. My name is Grant Wilson. I'm the Executive Director at Earth Law Center. Hopefully this is coming across on the image there. I'm going to talk about some legal concepts, including ecocentric law and earth-centered law in relation to de-extinction. I am a lawyer for the earth. I work to give nature and animals a voice in the legal system. I'm based in Southwest Colorado, but we have a team working in over 20 countries to give nature a voice, to give nature legal guardians that speak on their behalf, to give nature board seats, and to otherwise create this earth-centered legal framework in which nature is represented directly in the legal system. And I will tie this to de-extinction momentarily as sort of a different ethic from what we're proposing, and maybe a place to reflect upon why we are investigating this area in the first place. If you ever been to Durango, there's a train that comes through town and is coming by right now. So if you hear the horn there, that's good luck. I did want to touch on our environmental legal system. One of the justifications that we heard about for this so-called de-extinction movement is environmentalism. And I've long advocated for new environmental law frameworks that actually restore ecosystems to health. And I think looking at the problems of our current environmental laws is helpful to see if de-extinction can actually solve some of the environmental crises that we're undergoing. And a lot of people know that we've lost upwards of close to 80% of all animal populations just in the last 50 years of vertebrate species. We've lost half of coral reefs. I love gray wolves. Gray wolves are what got me into conservation when a pack of wolves came back to Washington State for the first time in 80 years and reestablished their habitat when I was a 20-year-old intern at a group called Conservation Northwest. And so I've seen the plight that they suffered, where they only have 10% of their historic habitat. And we've seen their populations go from hundreds of thousands to about 5,000 in the continental United States. And all of these things are happening because of this idea that nature is property, that we own nature, that it's a resource, that it's something we can buy, sell, and exploit. And we have these environmental laws like endangered species laws that are very helpful, but are really kind of damage control laws. They're emergency room laws that really protect a species when they're on the verge of extinction. And so as we look to, what are the solutions to this environmental crisis that we have, and is de-extinction, so-called de-extinction, part of the solution? To me, we have a broken system that treats nature and animals as property, and leaning into that broken system by treating animals even more so as property, up to the extent where we're trying to create copyright over their DNA, over their genetic materials, and to recreate designer animals that are called de-extinction, is the wrong pathway for solving these problems. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is the case. I did want to say this is sort of what I see as the next, another attempt in a long evolution of treating nature as a machine. And if you look at the kind of history of how we got to this current environmental crisis, a lot of it arrives from dating back to the scientific revolution, when we began looking at nature as a clock, or something that we can tinker with and control. And we continue to have this false mindset that humans are superior to nature, that we can control and own it. And we continue to look at that false mindset as a solution to the problems that are caused by our belief that nature is a machine or entity we can control in the first place. And so we see proposals for geoengineering to solve the climate crisis, monocultures to solve the climate crisis. Things like clean coal as a way of continuing the status quo of destroying nature and treating it as separate through techno fixes. And my really firm belief, and the belief of many people, is that we need to embrace an ethic that humans are part of nature, that nature is sacred, and that restoring nature into a state of balance is not going to be solved by short-term technological fixes. It's going to be solved by addressing root causes of environmental harms, by treating nature with respect and reverence. And the DNA of animals is one of the last sacred things we have untouched on the planet. And just ethically speaking, I think it is a grave mistake to think that we can, once again, manipulate nature all the way down to the molecular level to right the wrongs that we have caused over the last many hundred years. So I think you have to look at de-extinction not as a standalone experiment, but as something that's a trend of humans, once again, trying to treat nature as a machine. I am an earth lawyer. I work to give nature rights and a voice. But of course, I think it's important just to look at a couple of the current legal tools that come up with de-extinction. This is not what I do day to day, but so I'm more highlighting these than making firm legal conclusions that any of these certain areas have been implicated or violated. But there are issues that come up with de-extinction, so-called de-extinction. There's fraud, consumer protection. As we learned from the past presentations, is this really de-extinction, or are these proxies? Are they, in the case of dire wolves, genetically modified gray wolves? And this company, Colossal, is raising huge amounts of money under this premise that's stated over and over and over again of de-extinction. And is there a consumer protection concern there, where they're misrepresenting what's actually happening in reality, and funding is being secured on those grounds? So that's something to consider. We heard a lot about animal welfare and cruelty laws. There are challenges here where there's certain animal welfare laws that kick in if there's federal funds received. Sometimes in some of the other areas of law I'll quickly mention, it matters if there's a commercial component to this, So far, that hasn't really been the case, although I almost guarantee that it's coming, including for carbon credits that are already being discussed for animals that sequester carbon, the further commodification of animals, once again, for human benefits. Is there scientific justification to the suffering of animals? What's the ultimate scientific justification here? In the US versus places like Europe, these standards are a little bit different. I'd say a little bit stronger in Europe. But things to think about. There's biosafety laws, there's rules for invasive species. Are dire wolves and other proxies of extinct species invasive? Are they non-native because they're actually genetically modified and not identical to the native species that are extinct? Will they cause environmental harms? All these things matter. There is an executive order pertaining to invasive species, but it's not something that's easy to enforce. It's more about creating structures and review. There is a history of FDA oversight for intentional genomic alterations. We saw this with genetically modified salmon. There was a legal challenge whether the FDA took a hard enough look at the potential impacts of genetically modified salmon. Could there be environmental impacts, and will there be a review triggered for some of these de-extinctions in the future? Part of that might matter as to whether there's an actual reintroduction or, again, a commercial purpose for these species. Are they being used for profits, being sold on the market, which could happen. We also see international laws. Unfortunately, the United States opts out of a lot of good international laws, including the Convention on Biological Diversity. But there are some issues with LMOs, living modified organisms, the safe handling of these species treated internationally. So things to consider. I think a bottom line here is there's some gray areas, there's some loopholes. The US is opting out of a lot of stuff. The current Trump administration, as I'll explain, seems to be in support of de-extinction. And I think we need clear regulation of this space. 13 years ago, I wrote a paper saying we need an international treaty of emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence and genetic engineering. And I maintained that 13 years later, that would have been a good idea. It's a lot harder now. We hear about runaway AI, and it's this freight train that's an existential risk to human life. And it would have been good to do the international treaty 13 years ago, but it's still not too late. So I think we need to start regulating these spaces urgently before they get away from us, because human impulses are just to keep developing them rapidly with minimal consideration of what the impacts are going to be. Speaking of the US government, this is Doug Burgum, Secretary of Interior, who said, quote, "The revival of the dire wolf heralds the advent of a thrilling new era of scientific wonder, showcasing how the concept of de-extinction could serve as a bedrock for modern species conservation." Wow. So one like red alarm I want to raise is the possibility of government using de-extinction as a way to limit the Endangered Species Act by saying that any species is no longer in danger of extinction because we can de-extinct them. That's something we just need to put to bed immediately. The idea that a species can go extinct and we can de-extinct it, and therefore there's a loophole, or we have to no longer consider habitat protections in the same way, is one of the biggest risks to environmental laws I can think of. And that's just something the environmental community has to put to bed quickly, as something that should not even be considered. But just so you know, a lot of these environmental laws and regulations and agencies do have some discretion in how we address de-extinction, genetically modified animals. And I don't think they're taking it seriously enough at this point. All right, so that's kind of what's going on, the current system, the status quo. I'm an earth lawyer. I'm a rights and nature lawyer. I wanted to quickly mention, what does this rights of nature movement think about this? If you don't know, there's a global movement to recognize that nature has rights just as humans do, and also that animals have inherent intrinsic rights. And it's bubbling up in countries across the world. At least 5 countries acknowledge the rights of nature nationally, dozens subnationally: Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, national law in Spain, on and on. What does this movement think about de-extinction, quote, de-extinction? Well, Bolivia has a law on the rights of Mother Earth that says Mother Earth has the right to the diversity of life without being genetically altered or structurally modified in an artificial way, so that their existence, functioning, or future potential would be threatened. So there is some skepticism of to say the least, of genetically modified animals from the rights of nature community. There's also this ongoing debate of looking at nature as a commodity versus something with intrinsic value in international treaties, especially the Global Biodiversity Treaty, where there's a big movement to say, hey, the way to solve this environmental crisis is to further commodify nature. Let's put a price on nature. Biodiversity has a value. Let's see what that value is and start getting companies to pay for that. Let's animals, whales sequester carbon. Let's start putting the value on that and have companies offset their destruction of nature by commodifying animals and paying the price that they generate economically for ecosystem benefits. There's another movement that says we need to stop doing more of the same thing. We can't commodify nature our way out of the problem that started by commodifying nature. We need to recognize that nature has a voice, rights, intrinsic value. And so there's kind of this tension playing out internationally, and I think this is part of it. I will say that these international treaties I'm mentioning, again, the US has opted out of them, but it's sort of a larger ethical conversation globally. And I think as emerging technologies develop, this is just the tip of the iceberg of genetic engineering that's going to be possible for both animals and for humans and really the whole planet. We're seeing the tip of the iceberg of artificial intelligence and what it's possible of. And we need to be having conversations about ethics, environmental ethics, ecological ethics now, before these technologies are running away in a way where we can't pull them back. And these conversations are starting to happen. Rights of nature is part of the conversation, and now's the time to set what we believe in ethically. All right. I did want to say, I've been reading a lot about Colossal, George Church. I get the temptation if you have $3 or $4 billion to want to do something really, really big for the planet. I totally get that. It's like, I'm just going to sit here on this wealth. Like, no, there's like these amazing, impossible things that you can do with money. And I respect actually that inclination to go for big, bold earth shots with large amount of money from billionaires. I will say, if you are a billionaire and you crave radical innovation, I urge you to move out of this mindset of techno fixes, of nature as property and a thing that we can own and tinker with, and to really explore this idea of ecocentrism, of nature, of having a voice and rights. And these are just 4 little examples of Happy the elephant on the far left, where there was a case brought for its personhood to release it from the Bronx Zoo. And it went to the highest court in New York. It was not successful, but 2 of the justices in New York argued that, yes, Happy the elephant is a person. It feels emotion and pain just as humans do. We have to protect it as we would a person, and in this case, grant it habeas corpus. There's a whole movement for that. The second picture is Tokate, also known as Scully-Chuctanut in the Lummi indigenous terminology, an orca who was held captive in the smallest tank for an orca in the world for over 50 years. There was a movement to release Scully-Chuctanut based on the understanding that to the Lummi people, orcas are family members, they're relatives, they're kin, and they also deserve rights. And can we expand the law to not treat nature as property that we tinker with its genetics, but to treat nature as a family member or kin? And this is a legal movement beginning to emerge. The next photo, Estrellita, is a woolly monkey in Ecuador who was determined to have rights under Ecuador's constitution. The constitution talks about rights of nature. They said this applies to individual animals in certain cases as well. And they're working on hopeful legislation that will say animals have rights individually in Ecuador because they have a right to exist. For animals, the right to basic dignity is so important. And if you start worrying about slippery slope arguments for animal rights, well, hey, there's all these animals and some are live in homes and are captive, and is it going to upend the entire industry? Let's start at a place where animals have a right to basic dignity. Do these dire wolves have basic dignity? Do the dogs that were surrogates and where there were C-sections, did they have basic dignity? Where there's animals that are too large for their host parents because it's a woolly mammoth in an elephant's uterus, is this giving basic dignity to animals? Lastly, these are stingless bees of the Amazon on the far right there, and there's work in Peru to give them legal rights through a rights declaration. There's an amazing group called Amazon Research International working with Earth Law Center and the Leatherback Project and other folks. So the point here, again, if you believe in innovation, something new, exciting, transformative for the planet, I get that impulse. got $3 or $4 billion. How cool would it be just to lean into this, to pour all your resources into this idea that we can live in harmony with nature? And if you want technology, there's a lot of cool technology stuff happening too. We see indigenous coders into AI coding the reciprocity and relationality into AI technology. So it's not like humans own AI as kind of this slave-like framework, but if we're going to develop this new being that has sentience, which seems like we're on the way towards, what if we had a relationship of reciprocity based on indigenous values? This is really a cool thing happening that could dramatically transform the future if the emergence of superintelligence has an ethic that's different than the one that humans, Eurocentric societies have long purported over the last 300 or 400 years. There's immense potential there. We see Planet Labs having amazing satellite technology to take a live photo of the planet every day with immense detail so we can understand what's happening with the environmental crisis and how to fix it. We see the Earth Species Project doing really great work to use AI to listen to all of Earth's species. And when I first learned about this, my kind of like techno skepticism kicked in, and I'm like, oh, AI and animals. But I went and met them in Berkeley, and I was like, so animal two-way communication, like that's interesting. And what they told me is, we're really like the two-way communication, we're doing that, yeah, but the most important thing to us is listening to animals, using technology to listen to the natural world. Are we listening to nature when we do these genetic engineering projects? And I think listening to nature with technology is a beautiful goal where we can really sit and listen to the natural world and what does it want? And so we're working with the Earth Species Project to advise them on legal tools that we can use to protect species as we listen to them. And it's really exciting work. So if you want to innovate, if you want to bring in a new future to the planet and you believe in different ways of doing things, I hope some of these alternatives in law and technology are inspiring. To summarize, I think there is a lot of gray area in de-extinction. It implicates a lot of areas of the law, but it requires clarification. And again, this is the tip of the iceberg. Technological changes and innovations are going to continue to develop really beyond our imagination, and we need to set ethical frameworks, decision-making frameworks, and ideally treaties, or if not that, new laws now before these things run away and they're things we can't pull back. If you enjoyed these ecocentric law topics, I'm teaching a summer course called Earth Law. It starts June 2nd. You can see information on earthlawcenter.org/education. It's all about the rights of nature, rights of future generations, ecocide crime, and other interesting topics. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Grant. So thank you, all of you, for those wonderful presentations. There's lots of questions in the Q&A, and people can keep adding them. I think I'll start with, so some of them are to talk a little bit more about things that you've already raised. So one of the things that you raised is the sort of doubling down, if you will, on some of the problems that we already have and haven't fixed, right? And that we're just going to be replicating those problems. And one of the things that you didn't mention specifically is sort of gender bias. And I think recognizing that the animals we're using to gestate any of these animals are going to be female animals. And interestingly, Happy, Estrelita, and Tokutai are all females, right? And so there is already an imbalance in how we treat species by gender, both within the human species and across species. And those things are connected. So I'm wondering if anyone would be comfortable saying a little bit more about that.
I guess I can just say as a general point that I think I was recently researching biomimicry because I was on a panel about biomimicry in the law. And you can't help but to think of matriarchal societies and some of the ways that we can learn from those in our legal systems and leadership in our companies. And again, looking at this kind of often male-dominated, Eurocentric industries where we treat nature as a thing and property, I think there is something there with the gender bias and the need for a new perspective in leading industries and women's leadership, looking at you look at the matriarchal societies of bonobos versus chimpanzees, and they're friendly and believe in empathy and like dispute resolution, and the chimpanzees are, can become quite violent in these patriarchal societies. So I think there is something there to look at. That's just kind of a general reflection on kind of the leadership in our society and where we should be looking to in terms of North Stars for our relationship with nature. But that's a good point, and definitely a gender imbalance in the treatment of these surrogates.
Certainly, I'd say that in marine parks, for instance, cetaceans are objectified in that way as well. If you are a healthy young female orca, beluga whale, dolphin, you're a target as an incubation machine. And they often use artificial insemination, so you don't get any say in whether you want to be pregnant and be a parent. And it's an invasive procedure. And you're just inseminated over and over and over again at earlier and earlier ages. So there's no secret there that they're being used to create more and more captive subjects. Of course, the males are objectified as well because they're basically semen making genetic diversity machines as well. So, they're all objectified, but it's certainly the case I see in marine parks with cetaceans, as well as with elephants and many other large mammals, that they're basically used in a very objectified way. And if you're a young, healthy female in captivity, you're treated as a prized possession in a sense.
Thank you. Another thing that people seem interested in talking about is a little bit more about what would actually happen, where these animals would be. What is the actual likelihood that any of these animals would be reintroduced? For all of the reasons that you've suggested, it seems pretty problematic. And if they're not reintroduced, what is that life like? Lori, you mentioned Dolly the sheep, who ended up living her short life in the institute in which she was born, right? So she was never out in a more natural environment. So do you think these animals would be in zoos, subjects of, because there's got to be, we've talked about the money-making aspect of these animals, right? So if they aren't profitable for other kinds of market-based, and they may become profitable for that, but in the interim, would people be having them on display and having people pay to see them? Would they be in institutes and just used in the scientific sphere, do you think? Where do you think they would actually be living, and what would those lives be like?
Yeah, so I mean, I think at this stage they're much more likely to be living in captivity than in the wild. I mean, Grant can speak to all the legal difficulties of like figuring out how you get permits to put animals back in the wild that, haven't been there or that are completely new, and exactly how that's going to be regulated. But that's a huge minefield to be navigating. And so in the meantime, I can't see that these animals are going to do anything but stay in captivity, even if the stated intention is to recreate lost ecosystems of various kinds. And I think, you can't deny the money-making potential for this as well. You're going to get a lot of people willing to pay a lot of money to see a woolly mammoth, to hold a direwolf, do whatever these things are. And so I think there's sort of, the wrong kind of incentives here that, even where you've got sort of good intentions to do something more ecological with these animals, the fact that you can make all this money off of them and then, use that perhaps to go back into your programs and stuff, I think is going to be a reason to worry that they are much more likely to be housed in captivity, and in such a way that perhaps involves close human contact. Certainly, we see in zoos there's a big movement towards human-animal encounters of various kinds, and these can be more or less harmful to the animals depending on how much choice and control is given to the animal, how much dignity they're kind of given in the way that they're presented. But again, the worry is that the more you respect the animal's wishes, the more you have to let people who've paid their money not necessarily get the close encounter they were dreaming of. And so, in order to make people happy when they've paid and leave you good reviews, usually have to take some of that autonomy away from the animal. So I think there is a worry that that kind of thing is going to be taking place.
Agree.
And following on that, there's some questions about funding. And so as you've sort of already recognized, these animals are reifying the property status of animals in that they will be actually owned. And as Grant mentioned, maybe even their DNA copyrighted or patented, right? Depending on the laws of different countries. And so it seems less likely that someone who owns an animal would release that animal, right, into the wild, release their property, if this animal is privately owned. So a stream of questions is more information about the funding of this. Are any of you aware of government funding for this, or is it all in the private sector right now?
I don't know. I think it's all in private, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I suspect it is at the moment. Yeah, I think it's mostly this kind of private startup kind of funding that's happening here for these technologies. And so, I mean, one of the things people talk about in this space is the worry that funding is being redirected from conservation efforts into these. And I think given the nature of this funding, that's probably not what's happening because, you know, the people who are funding this would not have otherwise been funding conservation projects. It's not sort of government conservation money that's going here instead. So this kind of opportunity cost is perhaps not one of the greatest worries, although I think, you know, the worry about creating less of an urgency for conservation is still definitely there.
Yes, my understanding as well. It was private. On the last two questions, I will reflect that I think that environmental angle to this whole project is in my opinion, disingenuous. I see, you know, very marginal environmental benefits based on what's been stated and large environmental risks. I also, you know, think about kind of where is this all going? And this is my own speculation. I can't help but to think, though, this movement from certain, you know, tech billionaires to colonize space, to extend life, to genetically modify humans even. And is this all part of this dystopian future? I'm not sure. I did want to say apologies to the chimpanzees because I kind of threw them under the bus and people are saying how they're actually great too. So I love chimpanzees. They deserve rights as well, and are amazing species. But yeah, I think once they do get, you know, if they do get public funding in the future, it will open up some new legal avenues. When there's public funding, there's more scrutiny. Possibly there could be environmental review at some point of, you know, the Endangered Species Act, of different environmental laws, NEPA review at some point, depending on when the government gets involved in a different way and has a major agency action or something along those lines.
Well, and it also seems to me to add another reason not to trust the conservation arguments that are put forward as the reason to do this research, because the private companies aren't engaged in conservation. The government entities who are engaged in conservation aren't controlling right now the private research. And so how they can say these things are connected is actually kind of interesting, especially when we have government officials now saying, oh, if we have this technology, we don't need to worry so much about protecting the species who are threatened right now. That doesn't actually connect up at all in ways that might be useful for us to help people understand that we're talking about two different entities that aren't working together. And I think it actually shows the disingenuousness, right, of these arguments on both sides. Because again, how would a private company release these animals into the wild without some kind of permitting and some kind of government oversight? So, and we don't have systems or processes even on the table for that sort of thing. So, yeah. Great, thank you. More questions. So I think that you already, Heather, mentioned or explained that the sort of choice of use of resources isn't as big a problem right now as we might think it is, because this is the private. Are any of you aware that there is any government energy that is being diverted, or people are just saying now potentially if the science is there, we don't have to do the protection?
No, I'll just, I'm not aware that there's funds diverted away in a real concrete way, but I think that there are some real important psychological and cultural funds that are being diverted. Randy Malamud, a colleague of mine in Atlanta, has written a whole book about how when you go to see animals in zoos, the implicit message is don't worry about them in the wild, don't worry about their counterparts. They're right here. They're a car ride away, and you can watch them and eat popcorn, and there's no concern. And I believe that's true. And here, I think we're just taking it even farther. We're saying, don't worry at all about even any animals anywhere, because we can just bring them back, and extinction is no big deal. So we're just getting further and further and further away from showing animals in their ecological context and giving people a sense of who animals really are. They're not who they are unless they're in their natural environment.
And I guess I would add to that, you know, maybe the companies not now receiving governmental funding, but the scientists there are the product of, you know, decades in academia and receiving public funding to reach this level of brilliance that they've reached. So, you know, should the most brilliant people, and, you know, certainly George Church is brilliant and a lot of the people involved are brilliant. Should the most brilliant people that are a result of our, you know, collective society investments and people be spending their time on this or some of the other innovative solutions out there? And again, I want to say you know, I didn't mean to say over and over again billionaire tech investors, but I just want to offer the opportunity for folks in that camp to know that there's really, really exciting, world-changing things you can invest in that will be immense benefit and remembered for generations, that are in harmony with nature and in respect of the natural world. And, you know, I'd be really excited to talk to anyone about that camp, about what those opportunities are. And I think that, you know, if you're thinking legacy, changing the world, there's really, really interesting, exciting, innovative stuff that also could get investments that traditional environmentalism can't receive, because that was a point that Colossal brought up. We're not taking money because it's kind of new investors, but there's other stuff in that camp that I'd be excited to explore with those same folks.
Yeah, I think it would be lovely if we could turn away from trying to re-engineer the world and focus on repairing the damage that we're currently creating. But I think your point is really well taken, Lori, that this psychological framing, right, that these animals are just property, we can create them, we can, if they go extinct, it's not a problem, and we just have total control over everything about them, whether they live, where they live, how they live, all of that is it's sort of the opposite direction, that I think.
Yeah, exactly. It's the opposite of the messaging that the public should be getting.
Yeah. And interestingly, I think that leads to some other questions and comments that, so Grant, you had mentioned the Lummi people and their involvement with Tokutai, which was really helpful both in the legal framework and also I think in the social framework of recognizing them. So even if people who don't care about animals, if you want to respect the dignity of the indigenous people who recognize her as kin, that opens up a new way of thinking about animals in our world. And so what are your thoughts, the three of you, about learning from indigenous people and perspectives as we have these conversations?
Certainly, I think one of the things that comes from this kind of perspective that's really valuable for these sorts of conversations is this idea of, I guess, you know, the entanglement between humans and nature, humans and animals. You know, one of the things, the worries that, and I think, you know, Grant in particular has been raising about these kind of technological solutions is almost this separation of, you know, humans as this different thing and nature as a thing that we can then intervene on and control and we can like fix. And yeah, I think this idea of thinking about ourselves as part of nature, as, you know, part of the ecosystem, not standing above it, and, you know, looking at how we heal and repair things from within is a really important kind of way to be framing this, and I think would give us better results.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would I would add that I think there's a long history of, technological fixes being deployed without free prior informed consent of indigenous peoples that are impacted. Geoengineering certainly falls in that camp. I know my friends at Indigenous Environmental Network have long been pushing against geoengineering as a violation of the rights of Father Sky, if you want to put it that way, or sacred relationships with nature in different manifestations. And so I think there's a long history there of Eurocentric legal and techno fixes being deployed without adequate consultation or FPIC from indigenous communities. And so I think those conversations should come first before these technologies seem inevitable.
And Grant, maybe on related to that point, you've seen more success on the rights of nature in Central and South American countries, which were also colonized, but seem to have maybe a different relationship with some of the indigenous communities who weren't completely extirpated, right? Or the genocide was not complete. So do you have any thoughts, I guess, about why that social relationship is a little more successful, and that it then can build into the legal framework in ways that might be helpful for us in more Eurocentric countries?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts about that. I think, in Latin America, there's lots of indigenous leadership and government that's to a higher degree than some other places. That's important. I think there's just an ethic of, what can be called, Pachamama, buen vivir, these ideas of nature as a living entity and, good living in harmony with nature. That's a societal ethic. And I think that's a different ethic than, in mainstream United States, let's say. Obviously, it's multicultural in many ways, but just mainstream tendencies. I think, people live in deeper relationship with ecosystems and are on the front lines of a lot of environmental devastation in Latin America, and see the devastation that kind of the separateness causes, and that kind of wakes them up to some of these solutions. And I think a spirit of activism I see in Latin America. Last time I was there, the airport was on strike for something or other, and I was like, yeah, go. I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm supporting you. And just a spirit of activism there. I think, in the US here, or this de-extinction movement's happening, we need a spirit of activism, not just to accept that certain things are the way things are, but we should have, there should be a societal ethic that comes to light that shapes some of these future developments again. And that's so important to do now, before these emerging technologies are runaway technologies that are impossible to stop. We have to kind of put forth the ethic that we judge these things before they happen. So that's, now it's just the beginning.
Exactly.
That's helpful. And I think, so I'm wondering, Heather, in the ethics space, and Lori in the science space, and the more traditional science space, are you seeing these ethical conversations either coming from indigenous perspectives or rights of nature or earth aware environmental perspectives beginning to get some more purchase in the conversations about how to move forward?
It depends what groups that you've got the conversations in, sorry, Larry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, more, yes, significant, probably not. Yeah, so certainly, I think the idea that we should be listening to these kinds of perspectives is growing, but I think still the conversation is very much dominated by the more traditional sort of Western perspectives on these things.
I don't think, in just the general science space, academic science, research space, I mean, the genie's already out of the bottle, because we already allow for so many egregious harms to animals through invasive research, that this is just one more. It's a continuity. It's just, more and more and more genetic manipulation in more and more invasive ways, and smart. They know how to get around the ethical issues, because they've been doing it for generations, with their own research, invasive research. I mean, we have institutional review boards, and that they're not very discerning, shall we say. They don't really address real issues. It's about animal rights, animal welfare. It's something totally different and internal. So I don't have any confidence that, academic science is going to do anything other than what it's done in the past, which is usher it in, pretend that we're all concerned about the ethics, and let's go.
Well, and so joining that thought about ethics in these separate domains to the pragmatic context of de-extinction, one question raises the issue about veterinarian licensing. And so I think on what you all said, Heather in particular, we don't know what these animals need. We don't know sort of who they are. We're creating new individuals that haven't existed before, that are hybrids or clones or genetically engineered or what have you, however they got to be how they are. And how does a veterinarian ethically engage in his or her responsibility all the way through the process? Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
That's a $6 million question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think when you look at the permissiveness around how other species of research animals are housed and treated, we certainly don't have very tight controls on allowing animals to flourish as the kinds of creatures that they are within these spaces. And so I don't necessarily see the worries that I raised about the extinction being, a constraint from that point of view in terms of, what is the current policies and procedures. I guess to some degree, it depends how the animals end up being classified as well and what kinds of spaces they're in. So, for instance, the regulations around how you house an animal and the kinds of husbandry requirements you have for a zoo animal are very, very different and much more stringent than they are for, say, a laboratory animal. And so if these animals, after they're created, are housed in sort of a captive environment, perhaps they would then be subject to more of this sort of, I guess, more detailed, like husbandry regulations, which would put more restrictions on them than the laboratory context, which I think has less most of the time.
Yeah, and I suppose we run the risk of them not even being in the United States classified as animals, right?
Right,
We
right.
exempt certain animals from that classification so that we don't have to give
Exactly.
them the kinds of meet their needs in the way that we ought to. I was sort of hopeful, but it's probably just being naive, that we could go in the other direction and say, so we have some jurisdictions in the United States where folks finally said, and this is an entirely different context, that doctors shouldn't be participating in the death penalty, in the actual, giving of the injections, because that violated their Hippocratic oath. And some people were like, oh, like we hadn't really thought about it. When we do, that's sort of sort of irreconcilable conflict. Interestingly, because we also needed a medical person, technician who's licensed to give the shot, right? So we had this, but we did have at least one state withdraw medical personnel from doing that to protect them. And it might be interesting to say veterinarians, until they could determine at least a baseline of welfare needs, right? Of what the biological needs of a being would be, that they can't engage. And if veterinarians can't be licensed to work with these animals, then it might be one way to slow things down. But again,
Yeah, I think it's perhaps I'm less optimistic about that, because the role of veterinarians in terms of caring for animals rather than caring for the keepers of animals is in some cases, and this is not to speak about any specific veterinarians or whatever, but, when you look at the way veterinarians interact with the industrial animal agriculture industry, for instance, it's not clear that the interests of the animals over and above the kind of interests of the farms and the economics there is what's really taking place. And so in these kinds of issues, then perhaps we'll see the same unfortunate kind of trends in these as well.
That's a really good point, because depending upon the context, veterinarians do things that in a very general fundamental way, you would say veterinarians should not be doing that. If they're really all about the welfare of the animals. I mean, people were, like you said, Heather, working in agricultural settings. Is it in the best interest of the cow to have a hole punched in his side so that somebody can stick their hand in and pull out the ingredients of her stomach to do some research? And veterinarians sign off on that all the time. Is it in the best interest of a very, very young orca to be impregnated for the, X time, even though she's too young to be a mother and there's no social support for what she's doing. Veterinarians sign off on that all the time. So they are also driven by the context, and yet they're veterinarians. So that's problematic. Yeah.
And I think that you're both right that that's likely the direction it would head. I'm just trying to find ways to say this is different. Here's a line in the sand, right? And sort of to Grant's point, as we're developing new technologies, right? So we've done this historically, right? Veterinarians have worked with agricultural animals historically and done things. So it's more difficult to say what you've been doing for a long time is bad and you have to stop versus this is what you're going to be doing. And if we're going to develop these technologies, let's slow down, sort of to your point, Heather, and have a welfare plan before any of them go into effect. And that includes, what does that look like for the veterinarians? And if we can't answer that question, we can't, at least they can't go forward, right? I know it's sort of hopeful, but I'm looking for places to be hopeful. And so we may have time for one last question, and this may sort of be along those same lines in trying to find hope in the darkness. And the question was, given that we've had recent announcements, this is US specific, from the FDA and the NIH regarding the intention to move away from animals as experimental test subjects, is there maybe a way to connect these two things and say we should be moving away from this kind of behavior rather than expanding it? And to the degree that we're expanding it, maybe we should limit or somehow regulate that more closely. And that's obviously, this is a sort of a political question given our current politics in the United States that may be hard to answer, but any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'll just say very briefly, yeah, we seem to be moving away from using animals in invasive research. But, there's also, if you look at things on a more global level, there's also a big increase in the use of animals, because now nations who didn't have the capacity now are doing that, and there's just a widening array of ways that you can do invasive research with animals as these technologies come online. And so they're going to be used. So I don't know. I don't know if there really is a trend. I hope there is, but I'm not convinced yet. But I definitely would like there to be one.
And I guess I would point to another technological development as a good investment opportunity for all the young billionaires out there, which is using AI to replace animal testing. I think that's, holds a little promise. And once again, I know a couple of people in here are young billionaires considering what their next move is. So, I think there's so many cool investment opportunities. AI to replace animal testing, the animal communication with AI, like the Earth Species Project is doing really interesting stuff, giving nature a voice, and companies and board seats, all these things. So full of good ideas, no lack of good ideas. Reach out and let's try some of those. But yeah, AI to replace animal testing, that's one example that comes to mind, and maybe why the FDA can successfully move away from animal testing without losing a beat on some of the benefits of research.
I think that's right. And I think that sort of aligns with a lot of the comments, right, and questions, which is trying to find off ramps, right, for this, trying to redirect, to reframe the conversation, sort of to get back to first principles and to slow things down and not have this be sort of an unregulated free-for-all kind of marketplace where there are no restrictions, right? To raise these issues and say either there's scientific restrictions, ethical restrictions, legal restrictions, right, or even social sort of restrictions in how we think about this. And so I know we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you all for the work you're doing to further those goals, and just give you the opportunity, each of you, to say any last words if you have them.
Heather?
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really great to be here. And I guess what I really want to just do is re-emphasize this point that, if this is going to continue, that there needs to be a clear and explicit and transparent focus on welfare. So I guess, you know, my call to these sort of companies is what I would like to see is some like publicly available kind of housing husbandry standards and welfare plans, just to show that, you know, they do care and that they are engaged in these same questions as well. You know, I don't want to sort of paint these as terrible people who don't care at all about the animals that they're working with, but it would be nice to see, you know, some ways of sort of making that more rigorous.
Thanks. Grant?
Oh, thanks for having me here. I think I've said everything I need to. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thanks. Lori?
Yeah, I would just like to see more of an emphasis on rights, including welfare, but also rights, because that's an area that I think is underserved and under considered when it comes to other animals.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you all for your wonderful presentations. And a reminder that this has been recorded and we'll be posting it on our Animal Law YouTube channel at GW. So if you have any questions, let us know. And we'll be continuing our Animal Law and Science webinar series next year. So if you have questions, suggestions for panels, let us know and we'll see you in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Grant.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
much.
Bye.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.